I spent weeks preparing the perfect Thanksgiving dinner, and yet the house felt eerily quiet when I finally stepped inside. I set the table with my best china, polished silverware gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier, and carefully arranged the autumn-themed centerpiece in the middle. The scent of roasted turkey, fresh sage, and baked pumpkin pie filled the air, mingling with the warm aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg I had sprinkled into the homemade apple cider. Every detail was deliberate, from the folded linen napkins to the carefully labeled place cards, each one bearing a name I had hoped to see with a smile that day. Helen Carter, I whispered to myself, this is going to be perfect. I checked the clock on the wall. It was exactly 5:30 p.m., the time I had instructed everyone to arrive. The house was filled with the soft ticking of the grandfather clock, a gentle reminder of the hours I had poured into preparation, and the occasional hum of the refrigerator keeping the desserts cool. I walked from the kitchen to the dining room, imagining the laughter, the stories shared across the table, and the feeling of family gathering under one roof. My hands rested briefly on the back of a chair, its polished wood warm under my touch, and I felt a flutter of anticipation in my chest. I called out softly, "James? Amanda?" But only the echo of my voice returned, bouncing off the walls in a hollow mockery of the joyous welcome I had imagined. I moved to the window, peering down the driveway, half expecting a familiar car to pull up. Nothing. The autumn leaves swirled in the evening breeze, their colors a vivid reminder that the season was passing, and yet the warmth I had intended to share seemed to dissipate in the empty space around me. I set down the platter of golden turkey breast, carefully carved and arranged, and the mashed potatoes still steaming in their bowls. The cranberry sauce glistened like rubies, untouched. Each minute that passed seemed to stretch longer, the silence growing heavier, punctuated only by the ticking of the clock and the faint rustle of leaves outside. I walked back to the kitchen, my movements deliberate, arranging the cutlery. Just so, a silent ritual that grounded me in a world that suddenly felt fragile and unresponsive. My eyes flicked to the table, imagining James sitting at the head with Amanda beside him, their smiles and laughter that I had envisioned now existing only in my mind, a ghost of a family moment I had so carefully orchestrated. I moved to the living room, the soft upholstery of the couch still carrying the faint scent of candle wax from last week's decorations. I sank into the cushions briefly, closed my eyes, and drew in a steadying breath. The quiet allowed me to reflect, not in despair, but with a keen awareness of the disparity between expectation and reality. I opened the sliding glass doors to the patio, letting in the crisp November air, and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty yard. It was then that I noticed my phone had buzzed repeatedly with notifications I had ignored in the flurry of preparation. A text from James blinked on the screen. "Hey Mom, can't make it tonight. Busy with work stuff." Another from Amanda followed almost immediately. "Family dinner tomorrow instead. Hope that's okay." I stared at the messages, the warmth of the house suddenly replaced by a cold clarity. Weeks of planning, of care, of hope had been quietly rerouted, and I realized that the gathering I had envisioned was never meant to be for me, but for them. I stood and walked slowly back to the dining room, brushing my hand across the table as if to imprint my presence onto it. Each plate, each glass, each piece of silverware became a testament to the effort I had invested and to the absence of acknowledgement for that effort. The turkey, the pies, the cider, all remained untouched, and yet I did not feel the need to raise my voice or display anger. Instead, a quiet resolve settled over me, a recognition that my value, my time, and my love for this family were not diminished by their choices. I walked to the kitchen one last time, tasting a bit of the gravy with my finger, savoring the flavor I had created not for them, but for myself, for the satisfaction of knowing I had done everything right. The evening shadows deepened, the house still filled with the aromas of a feast that would go unseen. Yet Helen Carter remained seated in her role as observer, as orchestrator of her own dignity, her eyes scanning the empty chairs, imagining the possibilities of how to respond with grace and quiet cunning. The first seeds of a plan forming in her mind as the cool November air whispered through the curtains, carrying the scent of roasted turkey and autumn leaves and the promise of justice yet to come. I did not clear the table that night. I left everything exactly where it was, as if the empty chairs themselves deserved to witness what had happened. The candles burned low until tiny pools of wax formed around their bases. The turkey cooled. The apple pie sat untouched beneath its glass cover. Outside, the wind carried dry leaves across the driveway, and inside, the silence settled over the house like a heavy blanket. Around 9 o'clock, I finally poured myself a cup of coffee and sat alone at the dining room table. The place cards remained neatly arranged. James, Amanda, my grandson Ethan, my granddaughter Lily. Each name felt strangely distant, as though they belonged to people I used to know rather than the family I had spent decades loving. I stared at Amanda's card the longest. It was not because I disliked her. In fact, when she first married James 8 years ago, I had welcomed her with open arms. I remembered helping them furnish their first apartment. I remembered watching their children when they needed a weekend away. I remembered writing checks when unexpected expenses appeared. Back then, I believed gratitude was unnecessary because family was supposed to help family. But as I sat there in the quiet dining room, old memories began resurfacing one by one. Small moments, easy to dismiss individually, difficult to ignore when viewed together. Last Christmas, Amanda had called 2 days before dinner and explained that the children were feeling overwhelmed. They would celebrate privately at home instead. Later, I saw photographs online showing a house full of guests. The year before that, Ethan's baseball championship game had somehow changed locations at the last minute. Everyone else received the updated information except me. On Lily's birthday, I arrived carrying gifts only to discover the party had actually happened the day before. At the time, I accepted every explanation. I told myself misunderstandings happened. Schedules changed. People became busy. Yet now, sitting alone at a table prepared for guests who never intended to come, those explanations felt less convincing. I carried my coffee into the living room and lowered myself into my favorite armchair. Family photographs covered the shelves beside the fireplace. James at age 10 holding his first fishing rod. James graduating from college. James standing beside Amanda on their wedding day. I studied each picture carefully. Somewhere along the way, the warmth in those memories had become tangled with something colder. Not hatred, not anger, something closer to disappointment. The kind that settles quietly into your bones. My phone buzzed again shortly after 10. Another message from James. Sorry about tonight, Mom. Work has been crazy lately. We will make it up to you soon. I read the sentence 3 times. Then I placed the phone face down on the side table. Work had become his explanation for everything. Missed birthdays, missed visits, missed conversations. The strange thing was that I no longer felt surprised. That realization hurt more than the empty house. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. I woke earlier than usual and walked downstairs. The remains of Thanksgiving still waited exactly where I had left them. The sight should have made me sad. Instead, I felt calm, almost detached. I began packing leftovers into containers. One for the refrigerator, several for the freezer. My movements were slow and methodical. As I worked, another notification appeared on my phone. This time it was not a text. It was a social media post. Amanda had uploaded a collection of photographs from the previous evening. My fingers froze above the counter. There they were. James, Amanda, Ethan, Lily, smiling beneath strings of decorative lights. A long dining table stretched behind them. Dozens of relatives filled the seats. Glasses raised. Plates overflowing. Laughter frozen in perfect photographs. My family had not spent Thanksgiving working late. They had not stayed home resting. They had not changed plans at the last minute. They had gathered together. Every single one of them. Without me. I looked at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down beside the cutting board. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The gathering had not happened at a restaurant. It had not happened at a friend's house. It had happened at Amanda's parents' home. And judging by the decorations, invitations, and matching outfits, this dinner had been planned weeks in advance. For several minutes, I simply sat at the kitchen counter staring at the photographs. The cheerful smiles. The carefully arranged decorations. The matching sweaters and shades of burgundy and cream. None of it looked spontaneous. This was not a last-minute invitation. This was an event that had been planned, coordinated, and anticipated. My eyes moved from face to face. There was my sister Patricia laughing beside Amanda's mother. There was my nephew Ryan holding a plate piled high with food. Even cousins who lived nearly 200 miles away had somehow managed to attend. Everyone seemed informed. Everyone seemed included. Everyone except me. I enlarged one of the photographs and noticed a printed sign hanging above the fireplace. It read, "The Henderson Family Thanksgiving Gathering." Beneath it was the date. The same date I had spent weeks preparing my own dinner. A strange calm settled over me. I expected anger. I expected tears. Instead, I felt clarity. The kind that arrives after a long period of confusion. I opened my refrigerator and continued organizing leftovers. Container after container. Shelf after shelf. The ordinary task helped steady my thoughts. By noon, the house looked normal again. The dining table was cleared. The dishes were washed. The decorations remained, but now they felt less festive and more like evidence. Around 2 o'clock, my sister called. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Happy Thanksgiving weekend, Helen," she said. I smiled despite myself. Patricia had never been very good at hiding things. "Did you have a nice dinner?" I asked. A brief silence followed. Just 1 second, but it was enough. "Oh, yes," she replied carefully. "It was lovely." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the kitchen window. "Amanda's parents hosted it, did they?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Helen, I assumed you knew." Those 6 words told me everything. Patricia genuinely believed I had chosen not to attend. "No," I said softly. "I did not know." The conversation changed immediately. Her cheerful tone disappeared. She began explaining how beautiful the evening had been, how everyone thought I already had plans, how Amanda mentioned I wanted a quiet holiday at home. I listened without interrupting. The explanation sounded rehearsed, not because Patricia was lying, but because she was repeating what she had been told. When we ended the call, I sat quietly for a long time. Amanda had not merely excluded me. She had rewritten the story before anyone could ask questions. She had created a version of events where my absence seemed voluntary. Clever. Very clever. That evening, I decided to review something I had not looked at in years. I opened an old wooden cabinet in my study and removed several photo albums. Dust coated the covers. As I turned the pages, decades of memories unfolded before me. Birthday parties, school graduations, Christmas mornings, summer vacations. I noticed something interesting. In nearly every photograph taken before Amanda entered the family, James stood close to me, his arm around my shoulder. His smile relaxed and genuine. Then the years progressed. The distance increased gradually. A step farther away in one picture, a shorter visit in another, fewer phone calls, more canceled plans. None of it had seemed alarming at the time because the changes happened slowly. Looking back now, however, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Relationships rarely collapse overnight. They erode inch by inch, excuse by excuse, holiday by holiday. As darkness settled outside, I closed the album and returned it to the cabinet. Then my phone vibrated again. This time it was Amanda. She had posted another photograph. The caption beneath it caught my attention immediately. "Grateful for everyone who showed up this year." I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. "Grateful for everyone who showed up." Not everyone who was invited. Everyone who showed up. The distinction was subtle, intentional, and for the first time since Thanksgiving began, I felt the faint outline of a plan taking shape in my mind. The following Monday felt strangely ordinary. The sky was gray. A cold breeze rattled the branches outside my kitchen window. The coffee maker hummed softly while I stood at the counter staring into my mug. On the surface, nothing had changed. Cars still passed along the street. Neighbors still walked their dogs. The world continued exactly as it had before. Yet something inside me had shifted. Once you see a pattern clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. For years, I had accepted every explanation that came my way. Every forgotten invitation. Every last-minute cancellation. Every holiday rearranged without my knowledge. I had convinced myself that modern families were simply busy. Children grew up. Lives became complicated. Circumstances changed. But now I found myself revisiting old conversations with a different perspective. Around noon, I drove to the grocery store. The parking lot was crowded with shoppers taking advantage of post-holiday sales. As I pushed my car through the aisles, I unexpectedly ran into an old friend named Margaret. We had attended church together for nearly 20 years. Margaret smiled warmly when she saw me. "Helen, I was so sorry to miss you on Thanksgiving," she said. I stopped walking. "Miss me?" I asked. Her expression changed immediately. At Amanda's parents' house, she said carefully. Amanda told everyone you decided not to come because you wanted some quiet time this year. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the shopping cart handle. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough for me to feel it. Margaret continued speaking. Honestly, I thought it sounded unusual. You have always loved family gatherings. I forced a polite smile. That was very thoughtful of her to explain my absence. Margaret nodded, unaware of the storm quietly building beneath my calm exterior. After we exchanged a few more pleasantries, I continued shopping. But her words followed me through every aisle. Amanda had not merely informed family members that I would not attend. She had actively managed the narrative. She had anticipated questions and prepared answers. That required planning, intention, effort. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Later that afternoon, I returned home and carried the grocery bags inside. As I unpacked vegetables and canned goods, my phone rang. It was James. The first real conversation he had attempted since the holiday. His voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. Hey Mom, he said. How have you been? I placed a carton of eggs into the refrigerator. I have been fine. There was a brief pause. Good, he replied. Amanda and I were thinking about stopping by next weekend. Thinking about stopping by. The word struck me as oddly formal. As though I were a distant relative rather than his mother. That sounds nice, I said calmly. How was Thanksgiving? Silence filled the line. Not long. Perhaps 2 seconds. But long enough. It was good, he finally answered. Just a small gathering. Small gathering. I nearly smiled. There had been nearly 30 people in the photographs. I could still see them clearly. The long tables. The crowded rooms. The endless smiling faces. I am glad everyone enjoyed themselves, I said. James cleared his throat. Then he changed the subject. We talked for another 5 minutes before ending the call. The moment I set the phone down, I understood something important. James was not merely avoiding the truth. He was protecting a version of reality that Amanda had created. Whether he realized it or not, he had become part of the story she was telling everyone. I walked into my study and opened a drawer containing years of family correspondence. Birthday cards, invitations, holiday letters. I began sorting through them slowly. And as I examined one document after another, a question emerged that refused to leave my mind. If Amanda had been rewriting family events for years, how many other stories had been altered before they ever reached me? The question lingered with me for the rest of the week. Every time I opened a drawer, sorted old paperwork, or glanced at a family photograph, I found myself wondering how many conversations had taken place without my knowledge. How many decisions had been made for me instead of with me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that exclusion rarely begins with a single event. It begins with small adjustments, tiny omissions, minor changes that seem harmless until years have passed and the distance has become impossible to ignore. On Wednesday afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my granddaughter Lily. She was 11 years old, bright, curious, and refreshingly honest in ways most adults had forgotten how to be. Grandma, she said excitedly, did you like the pictures from Thanksgiving? I smiled despite everything. The decorations were beautiful, I replied. I especially liked the pumpkins on the fireplace. Lily laughed. Amanda spent forever decorating. She started planning everything back in September. My smile faded slightly. September. That meant the gathering had been organized for nearly 2 months. Long before invitations would have been sent. Long before anyone claimed plans had changed. That sounds like a lot of work, I said carefully. It was, Lily replied. Mom kept making lists and calling people. She said she wanted to make sure everybody came this year. Everybody. Such a simple word. Yet hearing it from Lily carried more weight than she could possibly understand. After we ended the call, I sat quietly in my kitchen staring at the phone. The final missing piece had slipped into place. There had never been a scheduling conflict. There had never been confusion. There had never been a last-minute change. The event had been planned deliberately. Invitations had been coordinated deliberately. My absence had been explained deliberately. Every road led back to the same conclusion. I stood and walked toward the dining room. The autumn centerpiece still rested on the table. Most people would have thrown it away by now, but I had left it there. Perhaps because part of me needed the reminder. Perhaps because part of me was not finished learning from what had happened. As I adjusted one of the decorative candles, my eyes landed on a framed photograph sitting nearby. It showed James at 16 years old. He was standing beside me after winning a regional science competition. His smile was enormous. His arm was wrapped proudly around my shoulders. Looking at that picture hurt in a way the recent photographs did not. Because I remembered who he used to be. I remembered the boy who called every Sunday. The young man who once drove 3 hours through a snowstorm because he was worried I might feel lonely after his father's funeral. Somewhere beneath the layers of excuses and distance, that version of James still existed. At least I hoped he did. But hope was no longer enough. That evening, another notification appeared online. Amanda had shared additional photographs from the holiday gathering. Friends and relatives filled the comment section with compliments. Beautiful family. Wonderful memories. Perfect celebration. Then one comment caught my attention. It came from Amanda's aunt. I am so glad everyone finally got together after all these years. I stared at the sentence for several seconds. After all these years. The wording seemed odd, as though a family reunion had occurred after a long separation. Yet I lived less than 20 miles away. I saw some of those relatives regularly. Why would she phrase it that way? Unless someone had been telling a very different story behind the scenes. A story where I was distant, uninterested, unavailable. A story where my absence seemed normal. I closed the application and set my phone aside. Then I opened a notebook and wrote down every detail I had learned since Thanksgiving. Dates, conversations, photographs, comments, explanations, patterns. By the time I finished, several pages were filled. I looked down at the notes and felt something I had not felt in days. Confidence. For the first time, I was no longer reacting to what had happened. I was beginning to understand it. And understanding, I had learned throughout my life, was often the first step toward changing everything. By the following morning, Helen had already decided that clarity was not enough. Knowledge without action leaves the situation unchanged. She brewed a pot of coffee, poured herself a cup, and carried it to the study where she had laid out all her notes, photographs, and the printed messages from Amanda. She spread everything across the oak desk, organizing it by date, sender, and context. Each photograph, each comment, each text message, each phone call created a chain that mapped precisely how events had been manipulated. Helen did not feel anger in the explosive sense. She felt a cool, deliberate resolve. She picked up a pen and began writing a detailed account of the Thanksgiving incident, including every observation she had collected over the past week. The words flowed naturally, detailing Amanda's careful orchestration, James's participation or ignorance, and the network of explanations that had kept her out of sight. By the time she paused, she had a clear blueprint of what had happened and why. Next, Helen turned her attention to the practical side of things. She drafted a polite but firm letter to James and Amanda, acknowledging their communication, their plans, and their intentions, but subtly highlighting discrepancies that could not be ignored. She did not accuse. She stated facts, calmly and precisely, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Her goal was to establish a record, not to create conflict. The next hours were spent gathering documents she had not reviewed in years. Old family calendars, invitations, even her own notes about prior holidays. Each piece became part of a carefully built narrative, a personal archive of truth. While she organized, Helen paused occasionally to watch the sunlight shift through the windows, casting long, warm beams across the polished floor. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Perfect for contemplation. She visualized possible responses from James and Amanda. Predictable deflections, excuses, repeated explanations. Then she considered her own responses. Measured, factual, calm. No emotion exposed. Control maintained. Afternoon turned to evening, and Helen prepared dinner for herself. A simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables. She arranged it carefully on her best china, as though presenting it to an audience. Each bite was deliberate. Each movement calm. The ritual grounded her, allowing her mind to plan the next steps without distraction. After dinner, she sat back with a cup of tea, reviewing the accumulated evidence once more. Names, dates, messages, photographs, and observations all formed a cohesive narrative. Helen realized that patience would be her ally. The plan she was forming required timing, precision, and observation. She was not ready to confront, not yet. Instead, she would let the information speak, allow the facts to settle, and choose the right moment to assert them. The control she felt was almost intoxicating. For the first time, She recognized that exclusion did not have to be a permanent state. She could respond with intelligence, with strategy, and without sacrificing her dignity. The quiet in the house became a canvas for contemplation. Helen leaned back, letting the weight of the day settle, and allowed herself a small, confident smile. The framework for action had been established, and she knew exactly how to proceed. Not with drama, not with haste, but with deliberate, careful steps that would ensure she remained both observed and in control. The following week unfolded exactly as Helen expected. James and Amanda behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. A few cheerful messages appeared in the family group chat. Photographs of school activities, holiday decorations, a recipe Amanda wanted to share. The normal rhythm of family communication continued, but now Helen viewed every interaction through a different lens. She no longer focused on what people said. She paid attention to what they avoided saying. On Saturday morning, James and Amanda arrived with Ethan and Lily. Helen greeted them warmly at the front door. She hugged her grandchildren, complimented Lily's new winter coat, and asked Ethan about basketball practice. The children rushed inside, filling the house with energy that had been missing for weeks. Amanda carried a pie into the kitchen and smiled as though Thanksgiving had never happened. "We finally made it over," she said. Helen returned the smile. "I am glad you are here." They settled into the living room. Coffee was served. Casual conversation drifted from work schedules to holiday shopping. Helen listened carefully. Amanda spoke often. James mostly nodded. The dynamic was familiar now. Every time a topic approached uncomfortable territory, Amanda redirected the conversation with remarkable skill. Most people would never notice it. Helen noticed every single time. Around noon, Lily wandered into the study while the adults remained in the living room. Helen found her examining the old family photo albums stacked on a shelf. "Can I look through these?" Lily asked. "Of course," Helen replied. Together they sat at the desk turning page after page. Lily laughed at old hairstyles and pointed excitedly at photographs of her father as a child. Then she stopped at a picture from 15 years earlier. "Dad used to come here all the time," she observed. Helen glanced at the image. James stood on a ladder helping hang Christmas lights outside the house. "Yes," she said quietly. "He did." Lily frowned slightly. "Why do we not visit as much anymore?" Children have a way of asking questions adults spend years avoiding. Helen considered her answer carefully. "Sometimes people become busy and forget what matters," she said. Lily seemed to think about that for a moment before returning to the photographs. Later that afternoon, the family gathered around the dining table for lunch. Helen had prepared roast beef sandwiches, soup, and homemade cookies. Conversation flowed easily. Amanda described upcoming holiday plans. Then she casually mentioned a Christmas gathering at her parents' house. "We are still working out the guest list," Amanda said. Helen looked up from her plate. "That sounds lovely." Amanda smiled. "It should be fun." Helen noticed the slight hesitation that followed. A brief uncertainty. Just long enough to reveal that Amanda had expected a different reaction. Perhaps she anticipated disappointment. Perhaps she expected questions. Instead, Helen remained calm. The silence shifted the balance of the conversation in a subtle but important way. For the first time, Amanda seemed slightly uncomfortable. When the visit finally ended, Helen stood on the porch watching their vehicle disappear down the street. Then she returned inside and sat alone at the dining room table. The visit had confirmed what she already suspected. Amanda felt secure, completely secure. She believed the story she had created was working. She believed Helen would continue accepting explanations, overlooking details, and quietly moving forward. That confidence would become her greatest mistake. Helen opened her notebook and added several new observations to the growing list. Then she underlined one sentence she had written earlier in the week. "People reveal the truth most clearly when they believe nobody is paying attention." She closed the notebook and smiled, because now she was paying very close attention. The next morning, Helen rose early, the sunlight spilling through the windows in thin golden streaks across the kitchen floor. She brewed a pot of tea and carried it to the dining room, where the table remained impeccably arranged, a silent reminder of the previous week. She spent the first hour reviewing her notes once more, methodically cross-referencing dates, messages, and photographs to ensure every observation was documented clearly and accurately. As she worked, the house remained quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. By mid-morning, She had compiled a detailed timeline of events, from the earliest planning of the Thanksgiving gathering to the deliberate explanations Amanda had given family members to justify her absence. Helen then turned her attention to potential strategies, considering how to approach the situation without escalating tension or creating unnecessary conflict. She recognized that subtlety and patience would be more powerful than confrontation. Around 10 o'clock, her phone rang. It was her sister Patricia again, this time casually checking in. Helen answered with her usual warmth. They spoke briefly about mundane topics, the weather, local news, and a small neighborhood event. Patricia mentioned she had been helping Amanda organize the family photographs and decorations. Helen listened carefully, noting the ease with which Patricia recounted Amanda's role and the way she spoke as if everything had been ordinary and routine. After the call, Helen stood and walked to the living room, arranging a few pillows and straightening the throw blankets, each movement measured and deliberate. She poured herself another cup of tea and sat down to reflect on what she had learned. The key, she realized, was observation. Every detail of behavior, every phrase, every photograph was a clue. Amanda had assumed that repetition and subtlety would ensure her narrative went unchallenged. Helen now understood that she had the advantage of awareness. Throughout the afternoon, she checked her phone intermittently, reviewing social media posts from Amanda and James. Each post reinforced the same pattern: carefully curated images, selective storytelling, and controlled messaging that presented Amanda as thoughtful and proactive while minimizing Helen's involvement. Helen noted the patterns meticulously, aware that these small, repeated actions revealed more than any single statement could. She also noticed the moments where Amanda had expected a reaction and received none, moments of slight hesitation or uncertainty that went unnoticed by most observers. Helen marked those in her notes as critical points. As evening approached, she prepared a light dinner, keeping her movements calm and precise. She arranged the plates and poured a glass of water for herself, taking time to savor each bite. Every act, every decision, every careful observation was part of a plan forming in her mind. By the time the sun set, Helen had a complete picture of the previous week's events and the subtle manipulations at play. She leaned back in her chair and let the warm glow of the sunset settle over her. The house was quiet. The air felt still. Helen knew that she now had the clarity and patience to act strategically when the time was right, and that thought alone brought a quiet, steady satisfaction that carried her through the evening. Helen spent the entire morning reviewing her notes one last time. Each photograph, message, and observation spread across the dining room table like pieces of a carefully constructed puzzle. The sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the spreadsheets she had created to track the timeline of events, the emails she had saved, and the social media posts she had documented. Her mind moved deliberately from one piece of evidence to the next, connecting the dots, observing the patterns, and quietly planning her next move. Every small action she had recorded over the past few weeks revealed a larger picture, one that painted Amanda as meticulous, intentional, and confident that no one would challenge her narrative. Helen did not feel anger in the explosive sense, nor did she feel bitterness. Instead, she experienced a focused calm, a clarity that allowed her to consider every possibility and anticipate every reaction. Around 11 o'clock, James called to ask about a minor detail for the upcoming holiday weekend. Helen listened carefully, responding with short, measured answers that conveyed interest but revealed nothing of her growing understanding. She noted his pauses, the subtle shifts in his tone, and the indirect phrasing of questions, cataloging everything mentally. After the call, she placed her notebook beside her and walked to the kitchen to prepare a small snack, arranging the plate with deliberate care, as if the act of organizing food mirrored the meticulous planning in her mind. Each bite she took was methodical, allowing her thoughts to drift to the family dynamics and how Amanda had assumed control over narratives, choices, and events for years. By mid-afternoon, Helen reviewed a set of printed photographs once more, paying attention to the smallest details: who was standing near whom, the expressions on their faces, the subtle positioning of objects, and the sequence of events captured in the frames. She noted every inconsistency and every subtle cue that indicated orchestrated behavior. Then she sat back, letting her eyes roam across the study, the documents, and the photographs, and for the first time, she felt a quiet confidence settle over her. She realized that the power of observation, patience, and strategy had shifted in her favor. She did not need to act hastily. She did not need to confront aggressively. She simply needed to maintain her composure, record the facts, and allow the truth to reveal itself when the timing was right. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors, and Helen remained seated at the table, calmly sipping her tea. She glanced at the notes one last time, marking a few key observations, and then closed the notebook carefully. The day had provided her with clarity, understanding, and a growing sense of readiness. Everything she had learned over the past weeks had brought her to this moment. She was prepared, observant, and poised to act in a way that would assert her presence, maintain her dignity, and ensure that no future gathering would exclude her without consequence. Helen rose from the chair and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, her mind fully engaged, her thoughts clear, and her determination unwavering. She understood that the family had made assumptions about her passivity, but they had underestimated her patience, her attention to detail, and her ability to quietly gather evidence. Tonight, as the house settled into stillness and the last light of day faded, Helen Carter knew she was no longer just a passive observer. She was in control of her narrative, and the next steps would unfold exactly as she intended, with precision, calm, and quiet authority.